My name is David Siegel. I study economic bubbles, market collapse, and bank failures. I'm here to talk about the future of money, and my belief is that the goal of monetary policy, indeed the goal of government in general, should be to maximize a sustainable rate of economic growth. If you can maximize a strong, steadily growing economy, many good things happen, and many bad things don't happen. So to do that, I'm going to give you 4 radical new ideas about the past, present, and future of money. Now, how many people here think that gold is a good form of money? Anybody? 1, 2, 3. Anybody on the gold train thinking that, okay, these are the Austrians. I ask you to have an open mind while I completely disabuse everyone of that idea. Gold is a terrible form of money. It has been proven over the last hundreds of years. So to start talking about gold, we have to appreciate that since the 1700s, 1715, when John Law decided to print paper notes that represented gold, he realized that he could just print more and have more money, and created hyperinflation that destroyed the French economy. They did it again to finance the Napoleonic Wars. We did it in the United States to finance the Civil War, and most of the world printed up a whole lot of paper money to finance World War I, after which came the Great Depression. And the reason we had the Great Depression was simply gold hoarding. Gold hoarding. People would rather hold gold if they thought that they could get more paper money for it later if the paper was going to be worth less. This is called deflation, and deflation is very destructive. Deflation is so destructive that it's worth having a little bit of inflation just to stay away from it. Deflation caused by gold hoarding caused the Great Depression, a decade of lost value. I won't spend more time on gold, but I will be happy to, individually with people. Gold is not a flexible form of money, and a flexible form or an elastic form of money is the fiat system that we have today. The Federal Reserve and other reserve banks in the world are able to adjust the supply of money in the economy, and that helps curb inflation. So here is the track record of these central banks. Most central banks have essentially the same curve. This is the general rate of growth of the economy. And you can see that these shaded areas are recessions. Now, recessions, what causes them? Some mysterious common beliefs that things are, is it a shake? Is it when people have their beliefs shaken in the economy? Is it animal spirits? What is it that causes recessions? Well, if you study recessions, it's always caused by some small external shock, a demand shock or a supply shock, followed by bad monetary policy that makes money too tight and makes a bad thing much, much worse. So it's sort of on a next order of magnitude. Central banks make recessions much worse. We could recover from recessions quickly if we didn't have central bankers making bad decisions. This is across the board, except in Australia, where the central bank they have not had a recession in the last 27 years because they're managing their monetary policy differently than the rest. So recessions are bad. Recessions put people out of work. Recessions often put a lot of people out of work, and we have to realize that most of the time monetary policy is the cause of sustained recessions, of putting millions and millions of people out of work. Money gets too tight, the economy slows to a halt, and that's a cycle that then spins down and down and down, and then more and more people lose jobs. And you can tell that we're sort of right now at a very low level of unemployment, and typically when we're at a low level of unemployment, what happens next is some little shock causes something bad to happen, and the knock-on effects are added by central banks. So this is something we can fix. Now, central banks mostly look at inflation. They keep their eyes on inflation. They're driving down the road trying to steer inflation. You can see that when we finally got rid of gold, the gold standard in 1971, finally, the car was zooming all over the street. We didn't know how to steer the thing, and inflation went up like crazy, and then it went down and up. And now, finally, after 40 years of experience driving this machine, we have inflation more or less under control. Inflation is going to stay at about 2% target for the foreseeable future. And again, people who buy gold as a hedge against inflation or a hedge against fiat currencies falling apart are believing a belief system that largely doesn't reflect reality. The reality is that central banks are now pretty good at managing inflation. What they're not good at is managing growth. So they often try to lower inflation at the expense of growth, and that's what causes most of the recessions. Does this make sense? This is just fundamental, at a very high level, walk through what causes essentially the multiplication factor of what the Fed does, takes a small bad thing and makes it worse. And in fact, let me just go back here, we saw that in 2008, 2009. Many people think that it was a housing banking crisis and a bunch of financial engineering that caused a worldwide recession. That's not true. What happened was we did have about $4 trillion worth of bad debt in the United States caused by bad government policies, okay. And we had some banking problems, and it was relatively contained to Wall Street and Wall Street investors. Banks were over-leveraged, they were undercapitalized, but it's mostly the shareholders that should have, of those banks that should have lost money. What turned a banking, sort of a typical banking collapse, there are actually many in history, into a worldwide recession where you can see, I don't have a laser pointer, but we lost about $1 trillion of economic value worldwide and put millions, billions of people out of work for 5 years. What caused that was the Fed and the European Central Bank and the Bank of England with monetary policy that was so tight that the economy could not grow quickly out of that local shock. So they took a medium size, a real banking crisis in the banking sector and multiplied it 100 times to affect almost every man, woman, and child in the world, except for people in Australia, because they managed their money supply better. And Australia didn't have anywhere near the kind of devastating effects that we had in the Western world. So monetary policy counts. It matters a lot. It matters more than you think because you just don't see it every day, but it manifests in good economic times and bad economic times. And so I'm going to give you a radical new idea. The first radical new idea was that the Great Depression was caused by gold hoarding. The gold economy, by the way, set up the economic conditions for the rise of the Third Reich, for Hitler to come to power, was very much built on top of the collapse of the gold economy of that era. And now I'm going to give you a new idea of how to run a central bank. We can use a monetary policy that is fully automated and runs on autopilot and has no meetings, no brilliant economists, and really no models, and no human judgment. We can automate monetary policy by focusing on not inflation and growth separately, but inflation and growth together. This is called nominal GDP level targeting. It's technical, and I'm just going to skim over it. So nominal GDP is the GDP, the growth of the economy in today's dollars, not in inflation-adjusted dollars, but in the dollars we exchange every day. And the way it works is not by focusing on growth or inflation at all, but by focusing simply on one number, the nominal GDP target. And we set the target at about 5% for most economies. And that 5% is the only thing we care about. So if inflation is growing at 2% and growth is at 3%, great. But if inflation goes down, if prices go down but growth increases, we don't care. We don't touch anything. We have the same monetary policy, which is to say that if nominal GDP starts to dip, then we add money to the economy. If we see that the predictions of nominal GDP for the end of the year are starting to lower, we add money to the economy. Here, the NGDP target is what's important. If, on the other hand, growth goes down, but there's a lot of inflation and prices rise, we don't care. If it's stabilized at 5%, we don't touch monetary policy. Monetary policy only adds money to the economy if NGDP is going to be less than 5%, and it pulls money out of the economy if NGDP looks like it's going to exceed 5%. And yes, we can actually do this with smart contracts and tokenized pounds, and that's what I'm going to talk about next. So the concept of NGDP level targeting is that on a day-by-day basis, the central banks threaten to add or subtract more money according to the current projections of NGDP. We get the current projections of NGDP from a betting market, from a real-time betting market where people can bet on NGDP futures rather than looking at economic data from 6 months ago, which is like driving down the street looking in the rear-view mirror. We look at real-time NGDP expectations of the market. This is why we call it market monetarism. Market monetarism is a term for automatic NGDP level targeting. When there's a shock, NGDP level targeting will inject cash into the economy. When there's hypergrowth, or when things are very strong, a little too strong, and NGDP looks like it's going to exceed 5%, we pull money out of the economy. You may not be able to see it, but the knock-on effects are very real. And in fact, this is where we are more or less right now. We are at a point where most central banks should be very judiciously and consistently pulling money out of the markets by increasing interest rates, interest on reserves, selling bonds. They should be doing what they need to do to carry out their threat to maintain a 5% nominal growth level. This is a bit technical, but you can see the basic mechanism here. It has nothing to do with people making decisions and announcements. It's just maintaining a constant threat by the Treasury, by the central banks, to even this out and make sure that money goes into the economy as needed to offset too much growth or too little growth. Does this make sense? So that's market monetarism. And the way we do this with smart contracts is to invent CBDC, central bank digital currency. Most central banks have been talking about, this blockchain thing looks interesting. Maybe we should set up a research group to go figure out if we should put our entire monetary supply, all the pounds, for example, onto the blockchain and get rid of cash. We've been thinking maybe we should eradicate cash like we did smallpox. Is that a good idea? Well, they've looked at it. First of all, nobody really wants cash. It's heavy, it's expensive, and it's dangerous. So eventually, if you go forward 30 years, there's no more cash. Everything is digital, right? But in the meantime, the central banks have all pretty much uniformly said, we've looked at this, and we've decided to hold back. First of all, the technology is too immature, and we couldn't imagine which blockchain we would use. Even if we had our own, we're not sure. And second, they're afraid of narrow money. What's narrow money? Narrow money is essentially retail banking by the central banks. When the Bank of England says you can have an individual account with us, then people will get out of Barclays, they'll get out of all the retail banks, and they'll go put their money with the central bank. This is not as bad as central bankers think. Naturally, banks multiply the money supply by lending, right? When you borrow money, when you use a credit card, you're actually printing money. Everybody's aware of that. When you borrow money at all, account money is made up, and put in your account, and it's just comes out of thin air, but it's based on your good credit, or it's based on whatever collateral you put up. So it's not made from nothing. It's based on credit and assets. It's a way of liquidizing credit and assets so we can spend it. And that's a good thing, and banks and central banks want it. But you know what? People demand lending anyway. So if we went to a narrow form of money and everyone could just have an account with the central bank, lending would find a natural level anyway, because lending is a very popular, loans are very popular products. Credit cards are very popular products. Mortgages are very popular products. So I don't think that the central banks need to be afraid of narrow money, and that by essentially converting all pounds to not be accounts in banks and not be cash in the vault, but to actually being on a blockchain and being here in your wallet, we would then be able to, first of all, reduce a lot of the costs, reduce the friction, reduce the time, make money better, faster, and cheaper, and we could use smart contracts to implement the NGDP level targeting that I explained before. People complain a lot about the price of energy of Bitcoin. It's something like the size of the energy budget of the state of Denmark or the nation of Iceland or something. It's a huge amount of energy. And what is the energy for? It's to protect, it's to secure the blockchain so that it's immutable. That's why we're spending all this energy on all these blockchains. And if you think about it, it's not a zero-sum game. For this stuff, this cash in our wallets, we also spend a considerable amount protecting our money supply. It's more than the state, than the budget of, or than the NGDP of Denmark. We spend a lot of money protecting money, moving it, transporting it, safeguarding it from cybercrime and white-collar crime. We spend a ton of money to manage money and keep it safe. And so my fourth radical idea, my first one was gold is a bad idea and it leads to hyperinflation. Fiat is can be managed. Fiat money can be managed with NGDP level targeting. Central bank digital currency will make it safer, faster, better, and cheaper. And the fourth is that if we used a proof of stake algorithm and all our money was on our phones, we could run an entire monetary policy and secure it on the phones of the citizens of a country that use that currency. So how would that work? Everybody would have an app where it would not be an app, it would be a wallet. A wallet means you have the private keys to your assets, right? The assets sit on the blockchain, but if you have the private key, you own it, you can manage it, right? So in that wallet, which is proof of stake, you'd have your money, and for it's something like Hashgraph, for example, for every time you spend money, you do a transaction, you validate 10 transactions. And to validate 10 other transactions, random transaction, costs about as much as sending one small picture of a cat to a friend. It's not much energy, it's not much storage, and it doesn't take much time. So every time you spend money, your wallet automatically validates 10 other transactions, and that mesh network of validation maintains the security of the network without much energy and with a constant flow of millions of people doing this just by going through their normal, average, everyday lives, spending, receiving, and sending money. And that citizen mining idea could eliminate the central banks entirely, the vaults, the holdings, the gold. It wouldn't eliminate the central bank wallet, which is where we keep the reserves, because if you remember, we have to inject cash into the economy when growth slows, and we have to pull money out, and that goes into the central bank wallet, okay? But that could be automated through nominal level GDP level targeting via millions of citizens just using their wallets and businesses just transacting. And that's all they would have to do. And all of that infrastructure that we've built goes away and replaced by something that is faster, better, and cheaper. And remember, the goal of all of this is to maximize sustainable growth. Maximizing sustainable economic growth will eliminate recessions. We have the technology now to eliminate recessions. We have the technology to eliminate asset hoarding, to eliminate deflation. We can essentially eliminate inflation. All of these things can be controlled at a sustainable, maximal rate through algorithms. And the algorithms can run on these things. I hope that gives you some appreciation for where we're going. Thank you very much.